When these steps on the edge of Brussels' Turkish district were built, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk was in turn a Turkish army officer, revolutionary, and the first president of Turkey. He is credited with being the founder of the Republic of Turkey. He was not just a great leader in his day, but a leader with great political foresight. In 1933, he said, "Today, the Soviet Union is a friend and an ally. We need this friendship. However, no one can know what will happen tomorrow. Just like the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, it may tear itself apart or shrink in size."
When I was 1 year ago in Turkey, I was a bit critical about the flirtation they were doing with Putin. Well, I think now 1 year after, you see that of course this situation completely changed. Turkey, whether it wanted it or not, made itself completely also dependent on the European Union. You see geopolitically, Turkey's only good relationship with its neighbors is still with the European Union.
Many European politicians openly chastise President Erdogan for his increasingly autocratic power play. Frankly, Erdogan doesn't really care. International pressure means little to him when he remains so popular at home, and some analysts observe this has led to a centralizing doctrine twinned with a heavy-handed use of law against opponents, especially journalists.
We have a very lively press, and if everybody could understand Turkish, they would see that there's a lot of harsh criticism going down in the media. Not only the written press, but also the television and a lot of discussions going on in Turkey. So it's a pretty free society, but there are of course some limits, limits of criticism with regard to insulting. We've seen that in Europe as well. So people maybe confuse this limit of insulting as freedom of expression. And therefore I think we have to give more explanations to our EU colleagues. But I see that they're getting the same medicine in their own countries.
President Erdogan must surely see hypocrisy when Europe is at the table. Spain's media gag laws are cut from the same cloth as Erdogan's punishment of the press. Hungary and Poland are sailing towards greater limits on freedom of expression, and yet Europe is begging Turkey for help to deal with the migration crisis. Europe is refusing to live up to its own values and trying to outsource its conscience to Turkey.
You saw that when the European Commission had a very critical report about the internal situation in Turkey and decided at the request of the Turkish president to postpone it. You know, that gives the image that we're willing to look away from breaches of fundamental rights in order to get a deal.
Timmermans' refusal to publish details of Europe's migration deal with Turkey is an attitude divorced from the Commission's declarations of transparency and accountability.
Well, I believe it is unspeakable that we don't know the details of the deal that Vice President Timmermans made with the Turkish president or the government, and we need to know if the benchmarks are not clear and if this is merely a political handshake. The EU has been set up for disaster.
What was so secret about Vice President Timmermans' letter to President Erdogan that he was so hesitant and remained so hesitant to make public its contents?
You know that any correspondence that, for example, the members of the European Commission would have with their counterparts around the world sometimes make their way to the public, sometimes they don't. Normally they are a reflection of our policy, but they are also a correspondence with very particular aim in this respect. So it's not that we are talking about any kind of secrecy or transparency. It's simply the use of different tools that we simply have to have available in order to conduct the policy.
Why has Turkey taken in millions of refugees? Why has Turkey paid for the humanitarian needs of millions of refugees without complaint? Why has Turkey changed its labour laws to allow 700,000 Syrian refugees the right to work? Why has Turkey done everything Europe has failed to do? Is not the greater failing the death of thousands in the Mediterranean? Is not the greater failing the hypocrisy of Europe?
I think the EU has to focus on its own responsibility. It's an illusion to think that simply paying, albeit a lot of money, to Turkey will stop the flow of refugees. We have a lot of homework to do in the EU. There's not enough cooperation between countries, the resettlement is not working, and we have international legal obligations to shelter people that flee a war.
We have registered 2.5 million of the refugees in Turkey. We've given them a card, and they are allowed to have free health service.
Turkish society didn't collapse because of that. Why not?
On the contrary, we have a tradition of welcoming people. It goes down for centuries. We like to host people. I think that was also incumbent upon us because they were escaping a very dangerous area. And we believe that we had to open up. We had our limits, but I think that it was only the human thing to do.
Is Turkey taking advantage of Europe?
I don't think Turkey is taking advantage. Turkey is using, of course, possibilities what this opening gives it to her vis-à-vis relationship to European Union. I would not be willing to say that we are asking Turkey to do the dirty job because such things do not work in international relations. If partners are not treated fairly and equally, then it will simply pay back.
The EU has been patting us on the back until recently, and then when they saw last summer a huge wave, comparatively a huge wave for them, not for us, come into the EU, then they woke up and remembered us. And then, of course, they remembered to also open up their arms towards Turkey and provide accession again. So a number of things have changed, but I don't think that it's fair to say that they're looking for us to do their dirty work. They want our help.
Part of the solution is to try to see if we can help these people stay and work and have education in Turkey. But I don't want to call it, to name it as a sacrifice of the values. On the other hand, we have to work to see if there is an end to the war in Syria. This is the main issue. Otherwise, we're going to see more refugees coming to Turkey and to Europe.
The war with the Greeks lasts 3 years, from 1919 to 1922. The Turkish people know it is a war of extermination. Atrocious, no quarter given or asked. Thousands of Greeks fleeing before the armies of the man whom the British call the most terrible of all the terrible Turks. From the ships, bread comes to the docks for the desperate refugees. Bread so that they may live another day.
Do the Greek people have any sense that there could be real partnership, or is there always going to be a sense of mistrust?
As long as the strategy of the Turkish authorities is very aggressive with Greece, but also we see it with the EU, what's been happening, there's not going to be any establishment of any real trust between one part Turkey and the other side, Greece or Cyprus.
If we really want to see a new era on the relationship between Europe and Turkey, we have to have in front of us the Cyprus issue. If the Cyprus issue is being solved, then we are not going to see only an improvement to that relationship, but we are going to see a real new open path towards that dream of Turks.
For a number of years, Turkey was left alone to face rise of terrorism at its borders. And at this moment, Kurds are simultaneously, on the one hand, maybe one of the most reliable partners to fight ISIS, but at the same time, different Kurdish groups are belonging to terrorist groups like PKK, and basically they are also eventually challenging national sovereignty of Turkey.
Do you think Europeans understand the Kurdish conflict?
Well, I don't think that they understand it at all. I mean, we've seen, for example, our problem is not with the Kurds, it's with terrorism. And so right now there's this PKK organization, it's a terrorist organization also designated by the EU and the US. This is what we're fighting against. And PYD in Syria is also an extension of the PKK. And so they don't understand these distinctions. But our fight is definitely not with the Kurds. I mean, Kurds are living all around Turkey. Istanbul is one of the biggest Kurdish cities.
For Turkey, it's an existential threat that there might be groups who want secession from the country, that there will be like an autonomous Kurdish region in Syria. That, of course, explains very much their heavy reaction when it comes to what's happening in Syria. But of course, also inside Turkey, Let's not pretend as if the PKK is some peace-loving organization. It is on the EU terror list. That does not mean that there is a military solution or just the anti-terrorism solution to this question. It is about fundamental rights, and that in the end means that Turkey will have to find a peaceful way to deal with the Kurds inside the country.
Turkey's tough guy posturing with Russia puts Europe directly in the firing line because of NATO's collective defense principle. As a member of NATO, Turkey could activate Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which means that an attack against one ally is considered as an attack against all allies.
NATO is implementing the biggest increase in our collective defense since the end of the Cold War. Not to wage war, but to prevent war. To send a clear signal that an attack on any NATO ally will be met by forces from across the whole alliance.
The question is whether the United States and Turkey's European NATO allies are willing to risk a third world war to defend Turkey in military theaters as complex as Syria.
Throughout its history, Turkey's geographical position has destined it to be a bridge between East and West, and a battleground.
Do you think it would be prudent for Turkey to become part of the European Union?
Well, 10 years ago, I was very enthusiastic about that. Today, I have to admit, I am less enthusiastic, and I think that even Turks are less enthusiastic. If you compare the public support for EU membership in Turkey 10 years ago with the public support now, there is a very sharp decline. I think that the public is rather exhausted from that never-ending story of negotiations. Some countries in Europe also are playing a political game with that.
I'm very much in favor of a Turkish membership because I think they are needed in Europe and we need each other. It's good if Turkey could become a member, but of course they have a long way to go.
We have to drop that position what we have been taking in 2005 and so, telling that no matter do you comply with our values and Copenhagen criteria or not, you will not be a member. I think we should tell that EU doors are open if countries comply to our values, and that is a beginning.
We will continue to, first of all, engage with Turkey, also express our concerns as we have done repeatedly, for example, over the state of freedom of expression, freedom of media in Turkey right now, and very particular cases as well. So I wouldn't say that we've changed the criteria at all. The opposite is true. The criteria remain, and so do our expectations in this regard.
In 1933, Atatürk said, "Being ready does not mean that we will sit quietly and wait. We must get ready. By strengthening the natural bridges that exist between us, language is a bridge, religion is a bridge, history is a bridge. We must delve into our roots and reconstruct what history has divided. We cannot wait for them to approach us. We must reach out to them." And so it is. European voices must not fall silent in pursuit of better human rights in Turkey, but Europe must end its hypocrisy, not overlooking its own human rights failures. For he or she who seeks justice must come with clean hands. As Atatürk said, the natural bridges must be strengthened, and in our roots there is unity.